this is my last speaking engagement after 1 month of touring Europe. And what a beautiful experience for me, moving from one village to the next and speaking every day in a different village and talking to the people in each village and learning how they grow, what the problems are, what the joys are. And I originally came to Europe to go to a conference in France. And in that conference, there was people from all over the world, from South America, from China, from the South Pacific Islands. And there were all kinds of politics that the people had. There was the Democrats, the Republicans, the liberals, the conservatives, the Irish, the Catholics. You know, all these kind of people came together, and we came together over one thing, and that was our love of food, our love of the ecosystem, our love of what really matters in life, which is that we're surviving as primates, that we're thriving in our ecosystem. And so if there's a message that I learned from Europe, it's that we really can unite over something as simple as food and as simple as seeds. And so thank you all for teaching me that lesson. Nope. Sweet. So this is my team that sent me here to Europe. The Going to Seed organization crowdfunded my trip here, paid my expenses. The school here also paid for my travel, part of my travel. And so just like to say thank you to the hundreds of people that provided funding for my trip. I became involved with chefs because I was working on a tomato project, and Chef Dan Barber heard about the tomato project I was working on. And so this is Dan Barber at my farm, Dan Barber with two of my local chefs, Amber and Robin. I'll tell you a story about them later. No, I'll tell you a story about Amber right now. So next door to where I teach yoga, there was a restaurant. And the owner of the restaurant was a grumpy guy. And he would post signs on his door saying things like, "My staff really sucks, so we're closing today." You know, just a horrid person. And of course, he went out of business. But so Amber took over that restaurant. And what Amber says is she'll post on Facebook and say, "I have the most wonderful staff ever." Let's see, Catherine, she makes our pastries. She makes the finest pastries within 1,000 miles. And our suppliers are just wonderful. We get our meat from this wonderful dairy up in Idaho. And so her restaurant is just thriving. Because I think that food tastes better if the people that are making the food are happy and joyful, and they're loving on the food, they're loving on their customers. And so Amber has been a beautiful example of how to run a restaurant and how to run it good. And that's by just loving on your people, loving the work that you do, not approaching it like you as a robot, that you have to do the same thing every day in the same way, and it's boring and mechanical. Anyway, that was a long story. Dan Barber invited me to his restaurant many times, and we talk about deep things like gardening and farming, and how can you bring the garden into the farm and the farm into the garden. In Dan's kitchen, I speak to his chefs about farming. I speak to his, what do you call them, bus boys, the kitchen, the table staff, the waiting staff, the hospitality staff. We talk about gardening. Those staff go out into the garden. They harvest vegetables. I haven't ever saw them weeding, but they go out and they harvest the vegetables. So it's just been a beautiful collaboration of chef and farmer working together. This is where I farm. This is my field. This 5,000 feet elevation, 1,600 feet or meters elevation. The mountains are 2,500 meters elevation. So the cold air from those mountains comes down into my garden all year long. I have 3-month frost-free growing season. I have 5 months of snow that covers the ground. So it was a super difficult place for me to grow. This is an okra plant after an entire growing season. Okay, and the first little hint of frost, it was just dead. So okra, bad crop for my valley. When I was a young boy, I grew up as a farmer. My family had lived in the same farm for 6 generations. And I grew up and went away to the big city to become a chemist. And as a chemist, I was making pesticides, herbicides, war chemicals, just a nasty, terrible job. I had a nervous breakdown, ended up in a monastery to recover. While I was in the monastery, I took a vow that I would never use those chemicals again. That I would garden without those chemicals. So I went home to my village and I tried to grow my family's traditional varieties without chemicals. And because we grew hybrids, and the hybrids are designed to require chemicals. They require fertilizer, they require pesticides, they require herbicides, and they just wouldn't grow for me. So I was looking for a variety of corn that would grow for me in my conditions. I found this variety, which was made by a farmer in Indiana. The way he created it is he took 200 varieties of sweet corn and allowed them to cross-pollinate in his garden. He used the modern heirlooms, or the modern hybrids, the old heirlooms, indigenous American varieties. And then he shared the seeds with me. I grew it. It just thrived. No chemicals at all. I planted this corn on the same day as I planted the hybrid sweet corn that didn't have the poisons all around the seed. The hybrid sweet corn germinated at 5%. This germinated at 100%, just grew vigorously, boldly. And then I tasted it. Oh my. Each of those colors in that corn is a different flavor. And it's just joyful to eat and happy. It's not the boring white and yellow sweet corn that has way too much sugar that my family had been planting. So this kind of growing, at the time I called landrace gardening, and I currently call it adaptation agriculture because of landrace is a scientific term from the literature and people didn't understand, but they understand adaptation agriculture. And so my definition of a landrace would be a variety that is genetically diverse, promiscuously pollinating, so that it can become locally adapted. And it becomes part of a community of people, the insects, the microbes, the other plants that are growing in the garden. So it becomes you know, the variety becomes very integrated into the local conditions, the local community. What I have found with this kind of growing is that the ecosystem does 90% of the selection for me. And all I have to do is stay out of the way and let the ecosystem choose what plants are going to be growing there. And the promiscuous pollination and genetic diversity is important to that, because then the genetics can rearrange to find plants that really thrive for me. So I'll tell a story. Well, I decided after the success of that sweet corn that I would convert every variety that I grow into that kind of growing. So the first crop I decided to work with was cantaloupes. Cantaloupes don't grow in my valley. Everybody knows that they don't grow in my valley. There's no point trying, but I did anyway. So I got about 30 varieties of cantaloupes. I got them from the seed catalogs. I planted hybrids. I planted heirlooms. I planted just wherever I could find seeds. Most of the varieties that I planted totally failed the first year. They didn't germinate. They got this tall. The bugs ate them. They grew this big in the whole growing season. But a few plants produced a few fruits. This was my total harvest the first year out of hundreds of plants. And they're all green, immature, but I still saved the seeds from them and replanted. The second year, some plants barely grew. Some plants grew like crazy. There were 2 plants the second year that produced more fruit than 100 other varieties or 100 other plants combined. So, save the seeds, replant. The third year, I was harvesting bushels and bushels and bushels of muskmelons. And I was harvesting them way before the ends of the fall, or before the fall frost arrived. And I have pretty much found that third year to be the magical year, because what happens the first year is that anything that is not suitable for my garden just dies. That's the ecosystem doing the 80% of the selection, or the 90%. The second year, the best cross with the best, so that by the third year, my garden can really thrive. So my takeaway message from this is that land races solve their own problems. They know how to deal with they can learn how to deal with the climate, with the farmers' habits, with the insects, with the soil, or whatever it is that I had previously been trying to use poisons for, or materials, or labor. The plants can figure those things out for themselves. I have found over the years it's much easier to change the genetics of a plant than it is to change my ecosystem, to change my soil, to change the bugs that live in my garden, or even my own habits. So, the university near me conducted a survey of my customers one time. And they were asking, why do you buy produce from Joseph? And so I'm thinking, oh, because we know the farmer and we love him. Oh, because it's local, because it's organic, because we're saving the planet. No, my customers didn't care about any of that. What they cared about was flavor. That was the number one reason that my customers gave. And it wasn't just the number one, it was far above any other reason that they listed for buying my produce. And so you remember those muskmelons? Every year before I save seeds from them, I taste them. If they taste good, I save the seeds. If they taste bad, I throw the seeds away. So what I had been doing without realizing it is I had been selecting for these beautiful flavors that just make my heart sing. And not only flavors, but for aromas that just are so happy and they're so joyful. And so after the university did this survey and I realized what was happening, I started selecting for flavor intentionally. So now I have 2 selection criteria for my crops. It has to grow in my garden, and it has to taste beautiful. And if a variety does those 2 things for me, then I think it's just the most amazing variety. And I don't care much what the color is, what the shape is, you know, what the vine type is. If it grows beautiful and it tastes wonderful, then it belongs in my garden. And I sometimes get comments from people of, aren't you going to create monsters if you're allowing things to cross-pollinate? Are you going to poison your community? Are you going to, the plant's going to get spines and come and attack you? You know, all these fears that people have if things are allowed to cross. But what I have found is if you take a great parent, we call this a Hubbard squash in my area. It's savory, it's very dry. We call this a banana squash. It's watery and sweet. If you combine those 2 together, you get a hybrid. And hybrids tend to have traits that are halfway in between the traits of the parents. And the flavor of this squash is just delightful because it's got the savoriness of this parent and the sweetness of this parent. So it's just a joyful, happy squash. And one of the agreements that I have with my customers and my chefs is when I take fruit into them and they find a fruit that tastes amazing, they save the seeds for me. And so my chefs become plant breeders. And that relationship with my customers, with my chefs, has really helped to relieve some of the pressure on me as a plant breeder because I don't have to do all the work myself. I can put it out into the community, and the community, I'm going to fall over here, the community can help with the plant selection. So this is just the tasting party that we're doing. I'll cut all the squash. We cook them, in this case, fried in coconut oil for all you chefs out there, and then taste them. And one of the things that I have found over the years is that the fruits that are more colorful tend to taste better. And so all of my squash varieties, my melon varieties, are moving towards being more colorful because they're more flavorful. An example here of some squash that taste wonderful because they're high in beta carotene, and some squash that tastes less wonderful because not so much. And tasting is best done as community. So we get together, we have tasting parties, and just really enjoy the flavors and the association with each other. So those of you that are market farmers, you go and you sell this melon at the market, and you might sell it for 50, whatever. You might sell it for €4, but it has 60 euros worth of seeds in it. So do you really want to be farming for food, or do you want to be farming for seeds? Something to think about. In my case, I decided that I would become a seed seller. And so I moved my whole garden strongly towards growing seeds. Of course, if you're growing seeds, there's a lot that you don't want to save seeds for. So I still had plenty of produce for my loved ones, for my chefs, for my community. And for those of you that are chefs and you're helping your farmers save seeds, the seed saving is as easy as scooping these out, rinsing them off, putting on a plate to dry so that your farmers can take them home. And that can really help the farmer. It can really help your local community. One thing that happens when we grow varieties that are locally adapted is they grow stronger, faster, better. And when they're growing better, they taste better. And that relationship of local adaptation and flavor, I just see over and over and over again. Anyway, so remember that poor okra plant that died that I showed you earlier. Out of 100 okra plants, there was one plant that didn't even care about the frost. It just shrugged it off. And it had produced seeds. So therefore, that okra plant became the ancestor of the okra that I planted the next year. By the third year, the okra was taller than I am. I was harvesting enough okra that I could take okra to a farmer's market. Again, it's that third year that's the magical year where things really seem to thrive. So, once upon a time, there was a farmer, that's me, that was growing way too big of a garden, and he was losing crops to the weeds. And I was trying to grow carrots, and I just couldn't grow carrots successfully for market, because carrots, they take like 3 weeks to germinate, and they grow really slow, and the weeds just jump out of the ground and overwhelm them. And so I was losing my carrot crop to not weeding. So I decided, well, maybe we should apply these same sort of principles of adaptation agriculture to the carrots and to the weeding. So I planted a crop of carrots and didn't weed them. Didn't even try to weed them. I got a few carrots at the end of the growing season that were just these little tiny carrots, but saved them, replanted them, grew a seed crop, replanted the seeds. Second year, I got carrots, that were bigger. Okay. So the third year, I weeded the carrots one time, right after they germinated. You see, there's one carrot here that was like the carrots used to grow. Then there's other carrots here that were like the new population. So that third year, I was harvesting carrots that were 2.5 kilos. So just a beautiful experience of applying these principles to the weeds. When I grew up, we had a mentality that you had to control your garden the entire growing season. You had to dominate the ecosystem. You had to plant in straight rows. So this was the way I grew for many years. And then I started growing like this, where I stopped weeding the beans. The beans figured out how to thrive. And I currently have beans growing in my garden that are feral. They plant themselves, they grow themselves, they don't need any weeding, and all I have to do is go into the garden and harvest the beans at the end of the growing season. What a beautiful crop. A crop that takes care of itself, plants itself, and I don't have to worry about it. In my ideal ecosystem, every variety that I grew would conform to that kind of standard. It would just take care of itself. I do have a lot of plants in my garden that people call weeds. And they're perfectly edible. They taste delicious. They're healthy. And I pick them and I take them to farmer's market. sell them to my chefs. And just because there's something is called a weed and it's called bad, doesn't mean that it actually is. There's been a lot of brainwashing over the years about, you know, how we have to dominate all these plants that probably we should just be eating instead. And because I'm not spending so much labor in my garden, I can sing, I can dance, I can go to beautiful tulip festivals, I can sew myself wonderful clothing, I can learn to play guitar. I had another option, and is that I could have taken that time that was freed up to grow twice as many vegetables, but that didn't really appeal to me. And yeah, anyway. So, after I had been growing this way for a decade, one of my friends, one of my friends asked if she could have space in my garden. And I said, sure, go ahead. And in my squash, I have never had any problem with bugs or diseases. My squash just grows and it's happy and content. But so she got in the seed catalogs and she bought her fancy varieties. She planted them in my garden. And the squash bugs just came and devoured them. And all kinds of like blights and stuff came and attacked the squash. And they say that it's not polite to laugh at other people's misery. But I was so happy because it showed that those diseases, those bugs exist in my garden, but the bugs and the squash had figured out a way to coexist because I'm not poisoning them, I'm not disrupting the ecosystem, and so they had figured things out for themselves. You look at this picture, you see a whole bunch of cucumbers that are all infected by mildew and disease, but guess what? There's one plant here that's growing beautiful with no pesticides, no poisons. So that plant then becomes the ancestor of the next year's squash. This is what my cucumbers look like. Those yellow cucumbers are the most sweet, delightful cucumber I've ever eaten. They're just a joy. So I welcome bugs, pests, viruses, and molds into my garden. They are teaching my plants how to survive. They are selecting for plants that thrive in the ecosystem exactly as it exists. I'm not about changing my growing conditions. I'm about changing the genetics of the plants that I grow. One problem that I often see in gardens is people add compost to them. They add fertilizer. And what that does is, in the history of plants, nitrogen availability has always been a limiting factor to their growth. And so they never developed a mechanism to say no to nitrogen. So when there's too much nitrogen in the garden, it goes into the plants, it makes protein, peptides, and it poisons the plant. And then the plant, in my theory, cries out to the ecosystem, please help me, I'm being poisoned. Well, what in the ecosystem needs protein? The insects. So the insects come and devour enough of the plant so the plant can come back into balance. And so I believe that with adding less nitrogen into our gardens, we have less problems with pests. So I figured that I would do the same thing with tomatoes. Nope. I struggled and I struggled and I tried and I just couldn't make progress with the tomatoes. What happened to tomatoes is when they were domesticated, 95% of the genetic diversity of tomatoes got left in the Andes Mountain. And about 5% of that diversity ended up in Europe after they had traveled from the Andes to Mexico, from Mexico to Italy, from Italy to the rest of the world. And that genetic diversity that was lost was for how to deal with insects, how to deal with soils, the climate. And so I just couldn't make progress with tomatoes because they didn't have enough genetic diversity left in them. So, did the research, found some wild tomatoes that grew in the Andes. Look at those flowers. They're huge, and they're super attractive to pollinators. And so these wild tomatoes retained tremendous genetic diversity. And so I crossed those into domestic tomatoes. This flower, or the little flower, is a domestic tomato flower. The big flower is a cross between domestic and wild. So they're just these huge flowers that are super inviting of cross-pollination. And when crops are cross-pollination, they can solve for them, or cross-pollinating, they can solve problems for themselves that I was previously trying to solve with labor, materials, poisons. Just some more pictures of the flowers and the insects that love the flowers, diversity of the leaf shapes. We found all kinds of diversity in the fruits as well. And what was most interesting about the fruits was the flavors. We were finding flavors like mango, plum, tangerine, melon, just these beautiful, wonderful flavors. Here's what those tomatoes look like today. This photo was taken about a month ago. Just lovely, delightful plants. Chef Dan Barber heard about this project. The lady here came to my farm from New York she's Dan's plant breeder that he has on staff. The other chefs, Amber's there again, Chef Barney Northrup, Chef Robin. We were holding taste testing on these tomatoes, and so the chefs and I have really put a lot of effort into selecting for wonderful flavors. You see there's some flavors on here: yuck, wow, somewhere on here there's sea urchin. How would it be, chefs, if you could have a tomato that tasted like sea urchin? It might save you a lot of money on making sauces or who knows what. Or you might take some of these wonderful flavors in the tomatoes and make something that's unique to your restaurant. Or, Chef Dan, he makes two sauces out of my tomatoes. He makes a yellow sauce and he makes an orange sauce. They're still tomato sauces, but they have a different flavor profile than the red tomato sauce. And so just a delightful project. This is a taste testing by a bunch of farmers up in Idaho. That these two farmers here helped to grow this project some years ago. And again, we're mostly selecting for orange-colored fruits because when people taste them with blindfolds on, that's the flavor that they really enjoy the most. So the other interesting thing about this project is this here is a root hair of one of my tomato plants. All of the blue in that root hair are nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So because I haven't fertilized my garden in 15 years, the microbes and the tomatoes figured out how to cooperate with each other so that the tomatoes can basically make their own fertilizer. And supposedly, it's only, legumes that make fertilizer. But by just staying out of the way, letting the ecosystem take care of itself, they figured out how to thrive without me having to get in the middle of it and going and grabbing inputs and putting them into my garden. I do this same kind of work with about 100 species. This is a bunch of bakers that are in a field of wheat, and they are harvesting the wheat, baking small loaves, doing trials in close cooperation with the plant breeders and the farmers. This is 2 more farmers that are harvesting small-scale wheat. They were harvesting about 20-pound lots of the wheat. 10-kilo lots of wheat. So that was really useful. The chefs could take it into the kitchen, run trials, see what they liked, and really work closely together. One of the things that I select for in my ecosystem, there is one grain that lives feral in the ecosystem. It grows on the side of the road, it grows up the hills, it totally takes care of itself. It plants itself, it outcompetes the weeds, and it thrives. This is a rye. In my garden, it grows about 6 feet tall, and that is beautiful trait because the weeds only grow like 3 feet tall. And so, sorry, I'm in English again, whatever. So the only thing that I need to do with that grain is I just need to go into the wilds and harvest it. In 1 hour of labor, I can harvest and clean enough grain to feed myself for a week. What an amazing crop. So for 1 week worth of labor, I could feed myself for a year. Just an amazing crop. That is why we were able to build civilization, because of the super productivity of the grains. And for those of you that are small scale growers, don't shy away from the grains, because there's a lot of potential there to be staple crops and to become part of our growing. And for me, they plant themselves, and I never have to think about them again. This is some diversity in wheat in my garden. This particular plant or type of grain ended up being self-eliminating in my garden because it has no protection against the sparrows. And the others have these big spikes that ward off the sparrows. And so, again, the ecosystem selected for what thrives in my garden. So, thank you. Are we going to have a question and answer after the 5 minutes? Okay, thank you. So this is a loaf of bread made by Chef Amber that I told you about to start this. And it is just so joyful. She uses local grains that have our local terroir about them, and just a beautiful experience. Plus, in addition to the choosing good ingredients, she has good she has love around her plants. If she has a chef that is grumpy, she fires them. And so everybody in her restaurant, all the staff are joyful, happy. And it shows in the food, it shows in the customers they attract. And if that's the message that I really wanted to present to the chefs more than plant breeding. It's like, love your work. Anyway. So I gave up record keeping because one day I was in the field and I found out that I was spending more time record keeping than I was planting. And so I stopped the record keeping immediately. That means that I also lost the stories about Grandma Babushka's bean that she sewed in the hem of her skirt in Poland and dragged over to Denmark. You know, I lost all of those stories, and that's okay with me because there was thousands and thousands of those stories I was trying to keep track of, and it just overwhelmed me. I couldn't do it. So this allowed me to relax. It also allowed me not to keep thousands of pedigrees about what came from where in my garden. So chefs, what if somebody gave you a batch of beans like this? Could you cook with it? You know, how are you going to deal with it? Because that is the most productive type of beans and the most reliable type of beans that your farmers can grow. And you know, it's something to think about. So we know that this is risky for farmers to spend 3 years developing your own varieties. Cliff Family Foundation and Going to Seed are cooperating together to support farmers so that those first couple of years, if they have a crop failure by growing this way, that we can support them while they grow it. This kind of gardening, adaptation agriculture applies to trees, to perennials, to animals, and so we can really, you know, we don't have to limit it to vegetables. And this type of work is best done as community. Because of the huge size of the group today, I didn't have us do introductions ahead of time, but it's super important that we cooperate with each other, that we understand each other, that we hook up with each other, because a lot of you in this room are doing the same thing that your neighbor is that lives 100 kilometers away and you didn't meet them until today. So I hope that during lunch and during our off time that you'll make connections with each other you can take home with you. There is a landrace seed swap that goes on here in Europe. It's called the Serendipity Seed Swap. It's available on Going to Seed, where the farmers, the gardeners send seeds from each other and just take a few seeds out, add a few seeds. So it's a really inexpensive way to get started. There's also the Danish Seed Savers Association here that has a lot of really locally adapted seeds. Wonderful place to start. Vivi, who introduced me, has been involved in that, and they do wonderful work.